Before we get to our keynote, one other thing, I would like to bring up Ron Burke, who you all know from the previous panel, and he is also the president of the AAS Board of Directors. He'd like to make just a few kind of closing comments before this panel. Ron?
All right, and greatly appreciate the forbearance of the panel. Hello, Jim. Hello, Joel, Trudy, Frank. Did want to have the opportunity on behalf of the entire Society board both to appreciate all of your participation and invite all of your future engagement with the Society and across the Society as we continue to advance into the future. And in particular, on behalf of Executive Vice President Charles Segelmoyer and myself, to express our deep appreciation for all of the acumen, alacrity, and excellence that Jim Way brings to the Society as the Executive Director. So please join me in thanking and expressing that appreciation. Okay. And we do have a slate of 8, as we call it, areas where the future looks very different, and the Society is focusing on these future areas, and it's exciting across the board. And again, we welcome all of your participation and engagement as we continue to find our way into the future through these different channels and areas. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ron. And so let's just jump into the talk. So this segment is very generously sponsored by the Aerospace Corporation. Thank you, Ron and team. So moderating this discussion is Frank Slazer. Frank is a past president of AAS. He's now retired, and he's an all-around nice guy. So with that, I turn it over to you, Frank.
Yeah, that's a great intro. Yep. So real pleasure to be here, and real pleasure to be helping to host this panel. We have an abundance of riches here, and you're not going to hear much from me. We're going to let them talk. Format we're going to try to use here today, I've got some questions that I've developed to give an introduction to the panel. I'll let them make a few remarks each, and then we'll start these questions. I'm going to try to save, if you see me looking at my watch, it's not that I'm bored or going to miss a flight. It's primarily because I want to make sure I leave 10 minutes towards the end for audience questions. So we'll get on to that. Again, we also have a lot of local talent here, perhaps no better expressed than Jim Free, who's the Associate Administrator for Exploration Systems Development at NASA headquarters, former center director down here not that many years ago. Joel Kearns, Deputy Associate Administrator for Exploration and the Science Mission Directorate at NASA. And Trudy Kortes, who's the Director of Technology Demonstrations at NASA's Space Technology Mission Directorate. So, Jim, I'll turn it to you to offer a few comments.
Thanks, Frank. And actually, it's all local talent here. I think we're all still based. Here, yeah. So it's great to actually go to a speaking engagement where you drive from home. No, it's great to be here to certainly talk about what we're doing. I'll say at NASA. I want to make sure that everybody understands the integration across the three of us is the only way we're going to do Artemis. We're putting people on the moon to do science, and we're going to do that through the technology that's developed in STMD. So from my perspective, I'm happy to talk about what we're doing in ESTMD, but it's directly tied to serve what Joel needs in science and to use the great things that STMD is doing, and particularly Trudy in the TDM world that she leads, because that's the closest turning things over to flight for us. So look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Frank. I'd like to say that to answer a lot of these high priority scientific questions related to the moon, many of which actually have been recommended to NASA going back decades, we really need the use of the human systems and human related technology developed by ESTMD and STMD. So for example, one of the big science questions we've been asked to do for decades is to go investigate an area on the far side of the moon near the South Pole that's called South Pole Aitken crater. And the reason is because it seems to be an example of one of the oldest impact features in the Earth-Moon system. Of course, you don't see anything like that on Earth. It's all been worn away by weather and the track of time. But it's only by getting crew members there to really take a look at the exact samples you need to bring back, screen them, and then bring back enough of them so that you can really draw sound conclusions from it, that you can really answer these questions. So when you have a question like that, you're not going to do that with one robotic or teleoperated probe. You need it's going to be a focus of a big effort to do it. You could also say the same things about really understanding what volatiles are hidden in those permanently shadowed regions and craters on the world. To do that, we need crew, we need big systems, we need new technology that doesn't exist today. Trudy?
Okay, thanks, Joel. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here today. I see a lot of familiar faces. I always like to open with a joke. And as I was thinking about what that would be, thinking of the makeup of the panel, it dawned on me, I used to work for both Jim and Joel at points in my career, and I just thought there's nothing funny about that. There is no joke to be had there. So I'm skipping my opening joke. They're great sports. Anyway. As Frank said, I'm Trudy Kortes. I'm the Director of Technology Demonstrations within Space Technology Mission Directorate. We like to tout our pipeline from early stage to technology maturation to the flights that we do. I certainly don't have the market cornered on doing flight demonstrations. We do that in our small sat and flight opportunities program as well. We're venturing into that in our TechMat or game-changing area too. And besides that, we do like to say our tagline or the mantra we like to repeat is technology drives exploration. When we say it often, we believe it, and it sounds like others are starting to believe it too. So look forward to getting into the questions today. Thanks for having me on the panel.
So starting out with some questions here, I guess the first question really gets down to something that's been very important that I know Jim and his team has been working on for the last year, and it's not just the Exploration Mission Directorate, it's the entire of NASA that's been involved with this. It's developing the Moon to Mars Objectives Roadmap, which is something that was really well done, I thought, in terms of reaching out to industry, to academia, to really bringing all the stakeholders in. It's not a top-down driven process. It's a process that they've been developing, really reaching out to all the people that have some expertise and have some insights into it. So that's going to help them develop an architecture, and that's what they're actually starting to work on now. Some elements, obviously, they've already been talking about. But Jim, maybe you could talk a little bit about the benefits of having the objectives and strategies for the Moon to Mars plan in place now and how it's going to evolve over time.
Sure. So I think, Kevin, even starts before the objectives and starts with the whys that we have developed as an agency around science, national posture, and inspiration. And the objectives are derived from that. And I think in the short term, there's going to be a document out that kind of connects those the whys to the objectives. The objectives are out there, 63 of them. Science has the most. And having that connectivity really from a strategy to implementation, that's what really we did in the first architecture concept review, was connect objectives to what we're planning to do in our first 4 to 5 missions. The human lunar return segment is what we called it. So from my perspective, having that for that segment and then the remaining 3 allows us to really show strategy to implementation, which I think private industry has that goal. Maybe doesn't get there all the time, but having that as our guidepost, it's very clear. Here's the objectives. These are the objectives that will start to satisfy with each mission. We're never going to satisfy a single objective on a single mission. But we can line up and say, we need this element because we have this objective. I think it's very explainable to the public. The panel earlier about communication, explaining, the one gentleman talked about it's important to explain what we're doing and that we're doing a lot of it. Being able to explain that connection and people can see themselves and how that's important to them in their everyday life, or what they're doing for economic development, or how it helps inspire them, or what science it brings back that we learn that much more. So to me, having that architecture and connectivity is important. We're actually just finished the strategic analysis cycle for this coming November's review. It just takes us a while to get that in documentation. And this review is going to be about Mars. So from my perspective, we set this process in place that, as it was intended, was supposed to survive administration changes. We survived the last one, which to me is incredible. That we stayed on that same course. And now what we can serve up is, here's our exploration plan. It's not about, do you want to do it? It's how much of it do you want to do? Because it's hard to argue. You have to say, I don't want to do any exploration really kick it out the door. So for me, that connectivity is important.
Thank you. Joel, let's talk a little bit more about science, and important to know how science is driving the approach to be taking on exploration this time. That was one of the criticisms back in Apollo, and it's certainly up this plan we're doing right from the start. Maybe you could talk about how Artemis and lunar exploration priorities fit within the science mission directorates.
Yeah. Apollo did really outstanding science using the astronaut as a field geologist, but it was done at the probably the last 4 to 5 missions, right? In this case, how to accomplish the science objective has been recommended by NASA, by the National Academy on Science, Engineering, and Medicine, that we get through a process called a decadal survey for every science discipline that the advisors recommend that NASA pursue. Has been in from the beginning. Actually, the discussion started about to do that almost all the way back with Space Policy Directive 1, years ago. I got to personally be involved in generating the Moon to Mars objectives, and one of the things that was interesting about it was how all the different space mission directorate organizations, science, space technology, Jim's directorate, and space operations really all got together to look at all of the objectives and critique them and normalize them and make sure that we were focusing on the right things. And we weren't focusing on everything, and we're really focusing on things that really made sense to do with astronauts. So the White House, the last few White Houses, and the Congress and both parties have really given great support to lunar science within the overall science program. Again, the priorities that are recommended to us from the National Academy tell us roughly what they think we should be working on in what order in all the science efforts. And in the Planetary Science Decadal Survey, which is the one that we got most recently, which was back in 2022, there was a whole chapter on science and Artemis in science and human spaceflight, and specifically gave us very specific priorities for the Lunar Discovery and Exploration Program, which is the science program of the Moon, which sponsors both the robotic work to be done on the Moon and the human work to be done in Artemis. So we've had really consistent support, and we've had really consistent advice from our science bodies on what we should be working on. And we've flown that into the architecture and into the Moon to Mars objective.
Thank you. Trudy, similar question for you. How does having this strategy help in prioritizing technology development investments?
Yeah, well, certainly having something clear and laid out for us that we can use as guidance is critical. I think someone on the previous panel today called it a unifying document, which resonated with me. I'll just go over a little bit of history of STMD. We actually admired the decadal survey that SMD put out and thought about, should space technology have something like that? And this was a few years back. And so STMD undertook a very deliberate process to put that in place. We hired a chief architect who works with principal technologists and system capability leads. And, we started to work through what does that now we call strategic framework look like to get us to future, what we call envisioned future priorities. And the Moon to Mars objectives, and I don't mean this to make it sound like I'm minimizing it, it's an input to that. It's of course a very critical input, but the science decadal, and we have a chief technologist that we work with in SMD who monitors our stuff very closely and provides us with priority lists. We have industry panels where we get industry input. And then we have advisory committees that help us, and they give us recommendations. The NASA Advisory Council, Technology, Innovation, and Engineering Committee is one. The STIGR, the Space Technology Industry Government University Roundtable, also gives us recommendations. We take all those and we try our best, to synthesize that. And what that does is help guide our strategic investments. So that's the process. And then as far as Moon to Mars goes, we see ourselves in so much of it. First of all, there's 9 lunar objectives, 4 Mars objectives, and it starts with power, comm, position, navigation, and timing. And there's great examples of all that. So Astrobotic in the previous mission mentioned vertical solar array technology, which we're starting to look at. I would be completely remiss at a Glenn symposium if I didn't mention fission surface power, which Glenn leads for us. And we just put a solicitation out on the street a couple of weeks ago for a closed loop Brayton power conversion system for the design phase of that. So that's all, happening. We have excellent examples in all of these with comm. We've invested a significant amount in optical comm. Terrain relative navigation we demonstrated with Mars 2020, and it worked beautifully. The experts at JPL told us that it triangulated and zeroed in on its landing spot with something like 6 seconds, what the experts tell us. And there's other versions of that we're getting ready to adapt and use for other mission applications. So the process is in place now for STMD to guide how we make investments. And looking at some of the priorities for us, I'm going to go back a little bit, just what Jim said about the first, phase of this in human return. Capstone and our small-sat program was a huge success for us. It was, it's a precursor for Gateway to look at, orbit, stability in orbit for NRHO. So that was an important one for us. And then the things, there's others too, but the things we have coming up, we at Glenn just last week finished acceptance test procedures for QM1, which is the first qualification module from Aerojet that we've been working to develop and produce. And in August, that's going to start a year-long test campaign. That, along with the solar arrays, which if I have a chance, I'll talk a little bit about later, the rollout solar arrays are going to fly in power and propulsion element, part of Gateway. And then one of the CLIPS missions that I want to mention is IM2, which, if you'll grant us this, we consider it an all STMD mission. Is that okay to say, Joel? But it will fly Prime 1, which is a drill combined with a mass spectrometer and for ice mining. Along with 2 tipping points, which are public-private partnerships that we have. One with Nokia for a 4G system. That system will transmit at various distance back to a small rover. And then a hopper developed by Intuitive Machines that's going to hop into craters, collect photographs and science data, and send it back to rover. So a lot of technology, coming up, and a lot of demonstrations. It's hard for me to pick what is most important or, what I think is priority. It's like asking me to pick my favorite child, the middle one, by the way. But don't anybody tweet that out. Don't tweet that out. I'll get in big trouble. Anyway, and then, sorry, just one more thing. Looking towards the future, right? Entry, descent, landing. We just had a huge success with Lofted with a inflatable decelerator back in November that has Mars applications once we scale it up. Moxie is an oxygen conversion unit that we have on Perseverance. It's on its 15th run. Going to be really critical for ISRU, and then of course nuclear propulsion, which we're starting into a partnership with DARPA. So all of those things combined, what my message here to you is we see ourselves in every phase of the campaign, and we can do that because of the objectives that Jim and his team have laid out.
Jim, maybe you're the right one to start this off, but others chime in with this. And obviously, these are 3 of the big elements within NASA, but there's a lot of other aspects, whether the centers, the ISS, and the research being done there to enable exploration. How is the entire band being brought together to sing on this in harmony, hopefully?
I think first it comes about through the objectives. And let me talk about what you said first, the centers. We set an offsite with the center directors a couple of weeks ago, ourselves and Space Operations Mission Directorate. And there were some interesting topics. I'll leave it at that. But at one point I said, our budget goes to the centers. Our mission directorate budgets go to the centers. So, we have, I don't know, it's a ridiculously low percentage of our budget that actually stays at headquarters. So our work is done by the centers. Centers like Glenn, centers like JSC, KSC, Marshall, Stennis for us are the primary ones. So we depend on the centers. We depend on them to develop the skills. Our job is to help them keep those skills sharp with things like certain kinds of projects, in-house projects. That's certainly a passion of mine. So we don't do any of our work without the centers. That's where our programs are managed as well. Other parts of the agency, like ISS, for example, space operations in general, we still get our crew members from space operations. They still own the crew. They're responsible for their training and health and well-being. We use other ways to test our systems like ISS. We've had a carbon dioxide removal assembly on ISS for a number of years, oxygen generation assembly on ISS. We use that platform to test things on our crew members. We flew a radiation vest on Artemis 1. That radiation vest had flown with 5 different crew members on ISS, and we're comparing, fit, form, and function with what the torsos experienced on Artemis 1 in terms of radiation exposure. So it is every element. That the band singing, probably not the best analogy with me up here. I won't speak for you two, but the mission directors, I think, are working well together, and we're utilizing the implementers across the agency at the centers and in other programs to execute the mission.
I'll jump in and just say, and then from the practical side of things, there are certain things in place to help that. Communication obviously is key when you're doing something like this. So there's what is called a federated board that brings the mission directorates together to make sure there's regular communication about that. STMD has been included in that every step of the way, and traveling to events to support this, to make sure that we're all staying in lockstep. But I would say I see communication happening at all the levels where it's supposed to happen. Between the AAs and then our programs. It's not perfect. There's some things that we need to work on, but one that I kind of wanted to highlight was an example I had. It's really important grassroots level that our projects are talking to each other, and one critical one for us is cryogenic fluid management, which is centered both here at Glenn and at Marshall, where the kind of center of gravity with all the expertise is. And they do an outstanding job of keeping in touch with they're very cross-cutting. So their technology applies to ISRU and HLS and nuclear. And they have set up a process where they have ESDMD workshops on a regular basis to keep those lines of communication open. And I really admire it. I think they've done an outstanding job with that. So besides the things Jim mentioned, I just wanted to kind of mention some of the practical ways I see this kind of happening, real time and in a practical way.
I wanted to mention a couple of other groups that participate, in implementing the architecture, implementing the objectives. So for example, as Trudy brought up in science, we administer for the agency commercial lunar payload services, where we are paying American companies to give us the service of bringing our scientific experiments, our technology developments, our operations demonstrations to the surface of the moon. We have 9 of those awarded. We do 2 of them a year. We do that in response to all the mission directorates getting together to identify what experiments they would like to do in the future of the moon through an interdirectorate process that's set up. In science, the way we identify what investigations will go is we run an open competition that anyone can put proposals into. We ran such a competition at the end of last year. We just made the selection on Friday of the latest, what's called payloads and research investigations for the surface of the moon scientific instrument suite. And the selectee was Scott Anderson at Southwest Research Institute. It's very interesting. Scott's study is going to be to take a very new type of instrument set to the moon, where he's going to try to use instruments, not bringing the sample back, to actually understand the date of certain features on the moon. He's partnering with other people at other, say, universities in the United States, but also international partners. So he's going to address a major scientific question. He's going to do it by using CLIPS, which is a commercial service. He's working with internationals, and he's not only going to be demonstrating a technique which will help answer that scientific question, but as a technique, once it's demonstrated, we're going to be able to use in the future in the architecture with human and other robotic missions. So everything is very highly integrated between all these communities.
Thank you. So NASA's had a really good run in recent years, as you may know, with getting support in Congress, and made a great point in terms of actually made it through a really major administration change and kept the continuity going. Funding, however, has always been the thing that's impacted exploration programs in the past. We got a good markup in both the House and Senate CJS subcommittees and the appropriation side long way before the budget's done, and even if we get through this year, there's always challenges in the future. Maybe each one of you can talk a little bit about how the new approach with the roadmap, with the objectives being laid out, will help provide some more, I don't know, a capability to absorb changes in funding over time that may happen.
We'll let Trudy start.
Oh, thank you, Jim.
Right.
I appreciate that. Jim's full of surprises, isn't he? Okay. So budget cycles happen, go up and down, and STMD is no stranger to that. As any of you have worked STMD programs and projects know, what people might not know is that a full 65% of our budget is already allocated by the time it comes to us. It is congressionally directed or statutory requirements. Those are in bill language. And so that means if you obviously do the quick math, 35% of that is discretionary. And so the process that I talked about earlier with the framework that we put in place is hugely important for that. And what I would say, especially from an STMD perspective, is we cannot have budget pressures lull us into the temptation to cut our research and development funding. We like to use the word seed corn for the future, and these are long-term technology development processes that need to take place. And the other thing that, till you really work in a space technology environment for a while, it's hard to recognize the very iterative process that needs to take place when you're doing these things. You're learning about what happens at component, subsystem, system level, and you might uncover some things you didn't expect. Sometimes you can try to project, but you're not always going to know those things. So it feels to me like we are constantly reassessing that against the priorities. To me, it just seems like a very continual process. It's good. We have that framework in place to do so. We are reassessing something right now, in fact. Again, I mentioned the cryogenic fluid management portfolio in a recent announcement made by Jim's organization in HLS with Blue Origin, which is they're going to do some CFM work also. So because we have precious few dollars to spend, we shouldn't be duplicating efforts. So we're gonna look at that for the short term. We have 4 tipping points in place that are public-private partnerships with ULA, Lockheed Martin, SpaceX, and Edispace. They're going really well. 2 should launch next year, and 2 should launch in 25. So both 2 in 24 and 25. It's going to buy down gaps, but we're going to have still some gaps to close. Now we have to reassess against the new work coming into the agency, and that's the right thing to do. That's what we should be doing. So really, it comes down to prioritizing. How do you do that? How do you do that kind of on a continual basis? And we have to look at need dates, right? It all kind of ties to programmatics on schedule. What technologies do you need by when, and how much do you need to invest to get there? So that's kind of the continuum. And then Jim alluded to something earlier in his comments that I would bring up again, which is building resiliency into the plan as much as you can. I always tell the projects in my portfolio, as many things as you are applicable to makes you less vulnerable when budget cuts come around, and they will. And I don't know if people remember this, but solar electric propulsion was tied to the ARM mission. And that was the Asteroid Redirect and Retrieval mission. I might have to get that acronym wrong. It's been a long time since I used it. But it was tied to that. And I think there was some thought about if that mission gets canceled, does SEP go along with it? And we built resiliency into the system. It's obviously a very needed technology and capability, but that survived that. And so that's important to make sure the technologies and capabilities that we're investing in have multiple applications if possible, but we find a way to make that resilient and prioritize appropriately.
I was going to say, I think one of the advantages of having the Moon to Mars objectives and the way Jim is pursuing the architecture is it gives you unity of purpose and unity of communications, so that when a political leadership decides are they going to tell you specifically to do something or not do something, are they going to make certain levels of resources available, it's really mostly, particularly the second one, is really just a question of at the rate of which you make progress. So I've noticed in having stakeholders look at the Moon to Mars objectives and now the architecture work that's going on, that in general, there's agreement on what those objectives are. Some people have different opinions about what you should do in what order. They want to know, for many of them, more advanced things, because there's a large number of objectives. Well, how are you going to do that? What is it going to cost to actually do it? Does the country really want to invest in that? But I've seen a lot of buy-in into what those objectives should be, and the architecture that Jim and his team is coming up with. He's doing trades to come up with the effective and efficient architecture to do it. And again, in science, we get a lot of external advice every year from our advisory committees, from what are called our analysis groups, like the Mars Exploration Program Analysis Group or the Lunar Exploration Analysis Group, where they give us advice and they give us recommendations over and over. And again, those are usually, we get from them ideas of priorities and sequencing. But of course, as the government, we have to look at the portfolio and the resources that are available to figure out in what order and how we do those things. So again, having something like the Moon to Mars plan and architecture is really, really helpful to be able to communicate to folks.
Yeah, I would just add that we have a set of missions that we can put in place based on the architecture tied to objectives. What I think all three of us said to the first question. My perspective is we have to deliver. That's how we keep our advocacy strong. We have to deliver programs on time and on budget. That's really hard. We don't compare to other federal agencies. Redoing the IT system in another federal agency is a little bit different than building a human lander. That's not an excuse. We have to put in a plan together. We have to talk about how we're going to deliver, and when we're not going to get there, we have to explain ourselves. We have to explain why things are needed. If we can explain why things are needed, rooted in the objectives, it's not just because I want to make Center X healthy. It's because I want to determine the age of the solar system as shown in the regolith on the lunar surface. I didn't even come close to that one, Joel, but it's close enough for an engineer. It also helps us explain what we won't get done. When a budget cut comes, it's very clear to say we are not going to get X, Y, and Z done. And then the advocates for X, Y, and Z, perhaps in the science community or someone that's working on something, a technology in TDM, for example, can say, hey, it's important to me that I get this done because it keeps 300 jobs, right? It's all that tie together, I think is important. And I think it's really important for all of us to advocate for each other. We are not putting humans on the moon just to put humans on the moon. We're putting humans on the moon to do science and use the technology that this agency has developed. And if we all advocate and not pit one against the other, that's an important story going forward.
Let me build on that a little bit relative to a paradigm shift that's kind of been happening with NASA. There's been an increasing use of public-private partnerships and working with the private sector to develop capabilities like, for instance, EVA spacesuits or HLS landers, for that matter, that in the past would have been a NASA-driven, NASA-directed process, hiring contractors and kind of giving them, a lot of directional what to do. As we start looking at NASA in the future, and we talked a lot about technology investments. In the past, NASA would be the one that would decide, what kind of rocket cycle we're going to use, what propellant combinations. Now that's increasingly being done by the private sector actors who are providing the services. How do we talk about that in terms of how does NASA prioritize where to invest in technologies and which technologies to try to foster for exploration improvements?
I'm not the technology mission director. So.
Okay. We have STMD has a long history in public-private partnerships. We started this, quite a while ago with this notion that if industry is interested in it and willing to put some, X amount percentage into the non-recurring engineering types of development and wants to put it in their product line and we buy it back from them at a better price to us, then, we're all for that. We've done that. And so we have a lot of examples of that. Would the model change in the future? I don't know. It's been really successful for us and we plan to continue and go forward to do that. and I'll just say that, their success is our success. And sometimes maybe we need to back off and say, we're not going to tell you how to do it. We're just going to tell you what we want and have that kind of open dialogue. But I've seen a lot of great examples where we're working very symbiotically with industry, and have had a lot of great successes because of it. And I'm not sure we would have gotten there without each other. I've already mentioned Lofted. That was a great example for us of a partnership with ULA. We need that technology at the Agency for the Future. Crew and cargo landing on Mars, they need it currently for their business model with Vulcan. Astrobotic with the Talos thrusters that we're developing with them. Low temperature, long lasting, long duration, doesn't freeze, the propellant doesn't freeze in those Talos thrusters. And that's been a really great partnership for us too, and we'll demonstrate that as part of the CLIPS mission. And then the rollout solar arrays. I mean, this is going back a little bit, but that started in STMD in early stage, and SBIR, the small company in Santa Barbara area in Southern California, that we invested in, and was very successful. And again, going through our pipeline to technology maturation and then demonstration, it's been used on, those rollout solar arrays have been used on the DART mission, the double
Redirect.
thank you. As well as there's 3 sets up on ISS now. A 4th one is going up in 2025. Power and propulsion element will fly them. So I don't know if we declared TRL9 on that, perhaps, but probably should. But that's an example. It's of how it should work, right? That's really to us how it should work. And we offer resources too to companies when they're struggling, because again, we want to see them succeed, and so we kind of get to know their weak points and their where they need help from us, and we're more than willing to offer that to see them, do well. So,
Yeah, I would add the ISS cargo and crew, I think, set the baseline for the agency of how to do that, how to enable the private sector. In my mind, I'm sure Joel can talk about CLIPS. We're trying to take advantage of that with the EVA suits. We actually put all of our technology out there for contractors to use in their bid back to us. We actually transitioned workforce over through a structured plan so that industry could take on the workforce to take on the job. So while it's private industry, it's also former NASA folks who are working on it, so they understand the work. HLS, both providers used government task agreements. They could get, I think, up to 60 NASA people to work with them in specific areas. They put that in their proposals. We actually have NASA people working at the contractors. LTV, the lunar terrain vehicle we have out right now, is a big stretch for us. We haven't built a unpressurized rover in a long time, but there's been enough industry through, I think, 3 rounds of proving to us that there's a business case for those services. That's why we went out with those services. So we're trying to continue to push so we can work on the next things. If we want a base on the lunar surface, that's going to be a lot of money. That's going to be habitation. That's going to be access. That's going to be infrastructure. I'd love to talk to the gentleman who said about landing pads being the first thing that we need there. That has whole implications to us, but we need those dollars where we can save dollars buying services so that we can do the next elements. If we want to go to Mars, we have to start spending dollars on significant systems to go to Mars, not kind of nibbling around the edges. We have to start spending that because it's going to take us, 10, 15 years to get on that path. So we need to start doing that today. Our way to do that is to buy services, to do things like tipping point, things that Trudy does, CLIPS that SMD has done to open up our budget to get there.
I have one go back that I wanted to mention too. So another model that STMD has been using that we're seeing is quite successful, and it sounds simplistic to say this, but is around forming consortia that have, common goals. So we have the Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium, and we're just forming now a consortium around in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing. So I only bring that up because while it's not specifically focused on industry, it's industry, academia, and government getting together, and it shouldn't be just a bunch of people getting together in a room and talking. There's things being produced out of this. That's, to me, another critical way of a feedback loop that we've seen great success with. LSIC has 800 members in all 50 states, and I think the same amount of countries, so it's global. So to me, that's just another example of the types of things we're doing to try to kind of close that loop and make sure that we're keeping in touch with some of those new things you talked about, Frank.
Think of that. Joe, did you have a comment? No. Let me give you a question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. Okay, yeah. Yeah, if we could, give me one more question for Joel, and then if some of you already have questions, you want to go to one of the microphones around the room, that'd be helpful. Just real quick, though, but, when the Astrobotic presenter was speaking before, Dan Hendrickson, he talked about the fact that I think they had like 25 different payloads going on their first CLIPS mission. And I'm sure the similar things are true for the other CLIPS providers and that sort of thing. So, in the past, it would have been like NASA that develops, well, what do we want to learn from the moon? Now you've got commercial companies, you've got other entities, other governments that are doing that. How is the Science Mission Directorate, really integrating the science that we're getting from the moon and we will be getting from the moon from all these different players that are out there? Chandrayaan, the Indian mission that just launched, would be another good example. Is there a mechanism in place to try to either reduce overlap or try to develop some synergies that you can build on something somebody else has already been taking on?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the CLIPS model is that what NASA does is we go purchase the service from the company to bring NASA's defined equipment or experiments to the moon and get our data back. And of course, for them to be successful, we recognize that they are going to want to get other customers because it's their mission we're buying transport on. I mean, we don't own that lander. We didn't design the lander. We're not running the mission ops. We don't buy the launch vehicle. We don't buy the comm. We just buy a service from them. So we really encourage them to go out and get other customers, whether that's industry, international industry, other government agencies, international agencies. And the companies are really strongly, aggressively pursuing that. Having said that, they own the technology and the engineering of their systems. We're buying a service just like if we put transport in DHL, that wouldn't entitle us to look under DHL's hood to figure out, what type of motor they have in their vehicle they're using. But for the scientific experiments that we're buying transport on, we own that data, and when a mission takes place, we post that data pretty well as fast as we can, and we share it openly. Now, if we want to purchase, if the government wants to purchase data, for example, one of those CLIPS providers, if they mutually agree to it and the government's got an interest in it, we can buy particular data from them, like performance of their systems, plume interaction on the lunar surface, but that's got to be a mutual contract, right? And as part of that, there may be stipulations where there's part of that data that they will not publicly share, right? And we understand those terms when we go into a contract. Now, what we do, I had mentioned earlier that we post our science data a maximum of 6 months after we actually get it from the mission. And when we have international cooperations, if we fly an international's provided payload on a CLIPS landing, or we fly it outside of CLIPS on some other type of mission, we have that same agreement with that international partner. We tell them that we want to have all that data posted a maximum of 6 months after the mission so that the whole community can go in and take a look at the scientific data. And there's been at least one case where a prospective partner has said to us, well, we'd really like to work with you, but we don't want to make the data public. And we said, I'm sorry, we can't work with you. We've gone so far in NASA that for the initial CLIPS landings, we have a website set up that's going to point to the places where the scientific data will actually be deposited, and also give status of what is shared with us from the U.S. principal investigators during and immediately after the mission. And we're going to point people to see where that data is, to see if they can make use of it.
Thank you. All right, let's take some questions from the audience, please. I'm sure somebody's got a question. Come on, Jeff. You're being kind.
Question probably for Jim.
It's been about 3 months now since the Moon to Mars architecture was published. And I'm curious if you can sort of, any themes or summaries that have emerged from the feedback that you have received on the architecture and how that might influence either the architecture itself or the next cycle of the architecture review looking at Mars.
So we have had a lot of feedback, a lot of kind of one-on-one meetings with companies, international partners. We also had the international workshop that Joel talked about. We had the industry and academia workshop 3 weeks ago now, I think, with tremendous participation in both. I think we had 16 countries at the international workshop. I think about 50 folks traveled from all over the world for that. And we had, I don't even know how many participants, I don't know where Patrick went, how many participants in the industry workshop. Great feedback there as well. I think some of the themes are, I think you heard it maybe in the panel before, is, hey, what are our priorities? That was definitely feedback. Where should we invest? And probably, hey, some feedback on the process too, which has been really good, that we're folding into what we're doing right now. So I think we learned, which was a great aspect of what we did here. I think we had great products too, but learning about how to take the feedback, how to disposition it. We want to make sure people feel like they were heard and not just, hey, we went to this workshop and said all this stuff and NASA was like, thanks, see you later. That's a really important thing for us as well. So I think we have some parts of the architecture definition document that will be I know they'll be updated based on what we heard. We'll continue to break down the objectives into the other segments, the other 3 segments that are part of our architecture. And as I said, the strategic analysis cycle just finished for the review that's coming up in November. So from my perspective, both process and product, the input was phenomenal. I don't know if you have any thoughts or...
Yeah, I'd say that I think people are appreciating that we've been very consistent since we first put the really the draft out last year and started getting people's comments. We've been consistent in trying to focus on those objectives, and we've been consistent in asking people for their comments and trying to implement it. And I think they've recognized that over the last year. I will tell you that a question I get from scientists outside NASA is, what are you really doing? What are we as a group really doing to make sure science is really not only one of the reasons that we're going to implement these missions, but we're going to effectively infuse and do the science. And we spend a lot of effort working on that between all our groups. We right now, for example, are doing the competitions for the initial sets of scientists that will guide the geology work or the scientific instruments that will go on the very first Artemis landing mission. We're looking at the process. We work almost daily with Jim's folks about making sure that the vehicles and systems that are going to be developed will actually enable those science objectives to be realized. And we look at how are we going to get the science community even more involved in the planning for the future campaign segments behind lunar, HLR, human lunar return. So I would say it's been really good to see people see that how hard it's being worked, and that folks are that we're taking their comments, and at the same time they really want to see evidence that it's really turning into objectives and goals and systems that they're going to see.
Other questions? A shy crowd. Actually, we're just keeping them from the airplane.
What was it like to have Trudy as an employee? I think that's a question everybody wants to know.
I guess I'll give you one last question, which will be a nice overarching one maybe. But at the last count, I think we've got over 24 nations have signed the Artemis Accords, including a number of nations, Australia, the Indians, that haven't previously been involved with the space exploration program that the United States has been conducting, the ISS, that sort of thing. But new players that want to do exploration or interest in exploration. How do you go through the process of figuring out which international partners can fill which kind of roles, and what countries might be attractive to try to bring into the program because they bring some expertise or something like that?
And so I want to make sure I draw a distinction between the Accords and what we're doing kind of tightening bolts every day or planning the next element. The accords are how we're going to operate. And it's really how we're going to conduct ourselves when we do the Artemis missions. And I think folks that sign the accords are stepping up and saying, yes, I want to operate in an open, transparent way. I'm going to share my data, whatever I get from my lunar exploration efforts. The folks that are working with us on the Artemis programs and the missions are really folks that have come forward and said, I'd like to play a role in developing hardware or participating in the science, which is frankly the easiest way to become part of Artemis programs is getting on the science teams. It's not you don't have to come with this multiple tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. It's the way to get in and get the data that all of us are doing. And then how we talk about what programs people want to provide, from the European service module to the radiation vest that I mentioned earlier that was provided by joint work between the Germans and the Israelis. It's sitting down and having discussions. We start with a expression of interest. We get our formulation team together, and then we start through a whole series of agreements. Study agreements is the first one. We'd like to explore the opportunities to provide X, Y, and Z as part of the Artemis program, and we kind of let it mature from there. What we're asking everyone to do is take our objectives, compare them to yours from an international perspective. How do they overlap? How do what we're trying to do and our objectives fit with your objectives? And how's that play out in what you can contribute in an element? So still trying to stick to that strategic framework, not like, hey, what can my badge do on the moon? It's really rooted more in the objective side of things. So that's the differentiation between the accords. So accords are overarching over our program, but the hardware elements, it's a little bit different.
Okay, one last opportunity, please.
No, I know.
Hey, folks. This is very different than the other questions that you've been answering. So I'm Mary Wadle. I work at NASA Glenn. All of you, most of the folks in the room, or several of them, might be just maybe a little bit earlier in their career than you. And we've had a theme of mentoring and helping those come along with us. So any words of wisdom from your careers that you'd like to share with those folks in the room as they go forward and do their journey?
I would say learn from your elders, and by that I mean Jim and Joel up here. Several others in the room I could cite by name, but I won't. Yeah, that's a good question, Mary. I mean, I don't know. Take your career in a stepwise, process. Don't, rush into something, I think, before you feel ready. There's a lot of people who want to help you. Just really have to ask. And the hardest part is usually asking, and then, I don't know, getting over that, whatever might be holding you back from asking. But I'd ask for help. Probably a lot sooner in my career than I did. Not from Jim or Joel. I'm just kidding. I did.
I would say go find something you want to do and really try to make your mark and have a real accomplishment. At the same time, go get help. You can want to accomplish something, and if you don't drive to a goal, you won't see it. You won't learn, and you won't really make a new mark on the world. But you don't have to do it all yourself. One of the great things in the aerospace business is that there's all these smart people that like to talk to each other, and we'll give you help if you ask. And just because you ask for help doesn't mean that you weren't good enough or you couldn't do it all by yourself. The whole point is when you set a goal is you have to get it done. You don't have to do it all. You just have to get it done and drive it to a conclusion.
Yeah, I think ask questions, kind of the same thing of asking for help, but ask questions when you're in a meeting. Most likely people are wondering the same thing. They just don't have the courage to ask it. And developing that courage, I think, is a really important thing to do. Take on tasks that are going to push you well past your limits. Trust that when someone says, hey, go do this for me, they believe in you, and they have the faith you can do it, whether you see that or not. And keep trying new jobs, right? Don't think I'm in this job, I have to stay in it for 20 years. Go try and do something else. Push yourself. I had a supervisor once when I walked in his office. reach in a garbage can and say, hey, I have a great developmental assignment for you. That person's in the room, by the way. It turned out okay for me, but trust those people that see things in you there's no way you could possibly see.
Okay, we have a 2 o'clock deadline to be out of this room, so please join me in thanking the panelists for their participation and contributions today.